The cold did not arrive loudly. There was no storm at first, no howling wind, no thunder of snow against the walls. Instead it came quietly, like a held breath, across the land. In the far northern towns, people woke to a strange stillness. The sky was pale, almost colorless, stretched thin above rooftops dusted with frost. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys, not bending, not drifting, just standing there, frozen in place. That was the first sign something was different. Inside the houses, morning routines continued as usual. Kettles warmed on stoves. Boots were pulled on by doors. Radios murmured softly with weather reports no one listened to very closely. Winter was normal here. Cold was expected. Snow was familiar. But this cold felt heavier. When people stepped outside, it wrapped around them instantly. Not sharp, not biting, just deep, a cold that settled into coats and gloves and bones without resistance. Breath fell from mouths in thick white clouds and seemed to linger longer than it should have. Cars hesitated to start. Engines groaned like they were waking from uneasy sleep. Metal complained, doors stuck. Streetlights hummed faintly, as if unsure of themselves. By noon, the temperature had fallen further than anyone predicted. Schools sent children home early, offices closed quietly one by one. Store owners pulled their doors shut sooner than usual, flipping signs from open to closed without much thought, just a feeling that it was better to be inside. By evening, the streets were nearly empty. Snow began to fall then, not fast, not thick, but steady. Soft flakes drifted down under the streetlights, glowing gently, covering footsteps as soon as they were made. Sound faded. Even the town itself seemed to whisper. Inside thousands of homes, people settled in. Curtains were drawn. Extra blankets were taken from closets. Soup simmered longer than usual. Radios and televisions spoke of a cold front, of temperatures falling further overnight. No one yet used the word historic. No one yet knew that by morning doors would not open, roads would vanish, and the outside world would become something distant, something to be observed only through frosted windows. That night the cold kept falling, and the north began to lock itself closed. The night came early. Darkness slipped over the towns like a thick quilt, pressing everything into stillness. Streetlights flickered on, one by one, their glow softened by the falling snow, each circle of light floating alone in the quiet. The cold deepened after sunset, settling into the ground, into the walls, into the spaces between breaths. Inside the houses, people listened. Radiators clicked and sighed. Heaters hummed steadily, doing their best. Floorboards creaked softly as the temperature dropped. Windows fogged from the warmth within, turning the outside world into a blur of white and shadow. Families gathered closer than usual. Some sat at kitchen tables long after dinner was finished, hands wrapped around mugs that steamed gently. Others moved mattresses closer to heaters, building small islands of warmth in bedrooms and living rooms. Lamps stayed on, not for light, but for comfort. Outside, the snow never hurried. It fell patiently, layer upon layer, covering steps, cars, fences, and roads. The sound of it was almost nothing at all, just a faint hush, like someone slowly brushing fabric together. With each hour, the world grew softer, quieter, more distant. The radio spoke again, its voice calm but careful now. Temperatures were dropping faster than expected. Wind chill values were reaching levels not seen in decades. Travel was discouraged. People were advised to stay indoors. Some turned the radio off after that. Phones buzzed with messages from friends and family. "Are you warm? Did you hear the forecast? Do you have enough food?" Short replies were sent back, reassuring words. No one wanted to worry anyone else. Late into the night, the cold pressed harder. Pipes shuddered behind walls. Water slowed to a trickle in some homes. Frost crept along window edges like delicate white veins. Even the air inside felt different, thicker, heavier, as if winter itself had stepped across the threshold. In apartments and houses across the north, people finally lay down to sleep wrapped tightly in blankets, listening to the quiet. Outside, the temperature fell below, numbers people were used to seeing, and by the time dawn began to think about arriving, the land was no longer simply cold. It was frozen into place. Morning arrived slowly, as if it too was reluctant to face the cold. Light seeped through the curtains in a pale, uncertain way. It did not sparkle. It did not brighten. It simply revealed what the night had done. People woke and lay still for a moment, listening. The usual sounds of morning were missing. No distant engines, no footsteps on sidewalks, no voices carrying through the air. The silence felt thicker than the blankets pulled up to chins. When people finally rose and moved toward their windows, they stopped. Cars were gone, not truly gone, but buried so deeply under snow and ice that they looked like smooth white shapes resting in the street. Doors were outlined in frost, their edges sealed shut. Trees stood frozen, every branch stiff and glassy, each one holding the weight of ice like a memory. Some tried their doors. They did not open. Snow had drifted high against frames overnight, packed hard by wind and cold. The door handles were rimmed with ice, unyielding to gloves and bare hands alike. Even the bravest attempts ended with people stepping back, breath clouding in front of them, realizing what this meant. They were staying inside. In kitchens, kettles were filled again. In living rooms, blankets were gathered and stacked. People moved slowly, deliberately now, conserving warmth, conserving energy. Every small action felt heavier in the cold air. Phones lit up with alerts, roads were closed, emergency services were overwhelmed, power outages were being reported in nearby regions. Officials urged everyone to remain indoors until further notice. Windows became the only connection to the outside world. People stood by them quietly, watching snow swirl in soft spirals. The sky was a flat gray, stretching endlessly in all directions, as if the sun itself had decided not to interfere. Hours passed. Breakfast blended into late morning without anyone noticing. Time lost its usual shape. Without errands to run or places to go, the day folded inward, becoming smaller, slower, quieter. And across towns and cities, thousands of people shared the same realization. The North had frozen shut, not for a moment, not for a day, but for however long the cold decided to stay. By the time people accepted that no one was going anywhere, the day had settled into a new rhythm. It was not a busy rhythm. It was not hurried. It moved softly, shaped by necessity and patience. Homes became small worlds. Kitchens turned into gathering places where pots stayed warm longer than usual. Soup simmered slowly, not because it needed to, but because there was no reason to rush it. Bread was sliced carefully, crumbs brushed aside, and saved. Every meal felt a little more important than the one before. In living rooms, couches filled with blankets and quiet bodies. Children played games on the floor, their voices hushed by the strange stillness pressing against the walls. Adults sat nearby, reading books they had been meaning to finish, or simply staring into nothing at all. The cold outside did not move. Frost traced patterns on windows, delicate, branching designs that looked like leaves and feathers frozen in glass. People leaned close to study them, breathing softly, careful not to disturb the fragile beauty. Electric heaters worked without complaint, though everyone kept an eye on them. Lights were used sparingly. Doors between rooms were closed to hold warmth in. Simple habits shifted quietly, without discussion. Some tried calling neighbors. Through walls and across hallways, voices traveled faintly. People checked in on each other, asking about heat, about food, about pipes that might freeze. There was comfort in knowing others were awake, listening, waiting too. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The world did not clear, though. It simply stayed the same, white, sealed, motionless. The air itself seemed frozen, as if sound had nowhere to go. As evening approached, the light faded early again. Lamps clicked on one by one, casting warm circles across rooms that felt smaller now, but safer. Dinner was simple. Cleanup was slow. When night came for the second time, it felt heavier than the first. The realization settled in gently but firmly. This was only the beginning, and the cold, patient, and unmoving showed no sign of leaving. By the second night, time no longer behaved the way it usually did. Clocks still ticked, phones still showed the correct hour. But inside the quiet homes, minutes felt wider, softer, as if they had room to breathe. Without the need to hurry anywhere, the day unfolded slowly, like a long exhale. People slept in layers. Blankets were doubled and tripled. Coats were folded at the edges of beds, just in case. The sound of wind brushing against walls replaced the usual nighttime noises, steady and low, almost comforting in its persistence. Morning came again, pale and cold. Some people stopped opening the curtains right away. They already knew what waited outside: ice, snow, silence. There was no urgency to confirm it. Instead, they stayed inside the warmth a little longer, listening to the hum of heat and the quiet life of the house. Meals became markers of the day. Breakfast meant warmth returning to the kitchen. Lunch came when hunger suggested it, not when the clock demanded it. Dinner arrived early, often eaten slowly, with pauses between bites. People found small tasks to fill the hours. Drawers were organized. Old photographs were taken out and studied. Windows were wiped clear, only to fog again minutes later. Some wrote lists they did not need, just to give shape to time. Children built forts from cushions and blankets, crawling into them with books and toys, creating warm caves against the cold. Adults smiled quietly at this, recognizing the instinct to create shelter within shelter. Outside, nothing changed. Snowbanks stood tall and firm. Roads remained invisible beneath ice. The sky stayed muted and still. It felt as though the entire region was holding its breath together. As the day ended once more, people noticed something unexpected. The fear they felt at first had softened. In its place was a quiet acceptance, a shared understanding that for now, life had narrowed, and within that narrow space there was still warmth. Still food, still each other. The cold had slowed everything down, and time, stretched and gentle, followed. By the third day, the silence had its own presence. It was no longer just the absence of noise. It was something that filled rooms, settled into corners, and wrapped itself around thoughts. People noticed it most when they paused, when there was nothing to distract them. No traffic hummed in the distance, no footsteps passed outside, no doors slammed or engines coughed to life. The world had gone quiet in a way few remembered. Inside, even small sounds felt louder than they should. a spoon touching a bowl, a page turning, the soft click of a thermostat adjusting itself. Each noise lingered briefly, then faded into the stillness again. Some people turned on radios or televisions, not to listen closely, but to break the silence just a little. The voices sounded far away, careful and calm, repeating the same updates. Temperatures remained dangerously low. Roads were still closed. Crews were working as conditions allowed. The phrase "as conditions allow" stayed with people. Windows had become storybooks. People stood and watched shadows move across the snow as the sun traced its low, slow path across the sky. The light never rose high enough to feel warm. It skimmed the horizon and slipped away again, leaving long blue shadows behind. In apartments, neighbors knocked gently on shared walls, checking in without opening doors. In houses, people used phones to reach across fences they could not cross physically. Simple messages carried a lot of weight. We're okay. Still warm. Still here. At night, the cold pressed closer. The air near windows felt sharper. Frost thickened along glass edges, building delicate layers like lace. People adjusted blankets and added another sweater, another pair of socks. Sleep came, but lightly. Dreams were quiet, slow, filled with images of snow and light and long, empty streets. Even in sleep, the stillness followed. And outside, beneath the ice sky, the north remained unmoving, locked in place, waiting. By the fourth day, warmth was no longer something people assumed would always be there. It became something to watch, something to protect. Hands checked radiators more often now, hovering near them, feeling for steady heat. People learned which rooms stayed warmer and which ones cooled too quickly. Doors were kept closed. Curtains stayed drawn even during the day, holding what little warmth the homes could keep. Cooking changed. Meals were prepared carefully, using heat efficiently. Ovens were opened after baking, letting the warmth drift into kitchens and hallways. Pots were left on stoves just a little longer, not for taste, but for comfort. Water was treated gently. Faucets were turned slowly, pipes listened to closely. A drip here, a pause there. Small acts of care meant to prevent freezing behind walls. The sound of running water, even briefly, became reassuring. People layered themselves like the houses did. Shirts under sweaters, sweaters under coats, socks doubled, scarves wrapped loosely indoors. The cold did not leave the body easily now. It clung even inside, even while resting. Outside, the world remained unchanged. Snowbanks had hardened, their surfaces smooth and bright, reflecting the pale light of day. Trees stood perfectly still, every branch held in icy suspension. Even birds were rare now, their absence making the silence feel deeper. Despite it all, there was calm, not excitement, not fear, just a steady, quiet determination. People moved slower, spoke softer, rested more. They listened to the house, to each other, to the long breath of winter pressing against the walls. And somewhere beneath the quiet routines, a shared understanding grew. As long as there was warmth, as long as there was patience, they could wait. By the fifth day, people began to measure time differently, not by clocks, not by schedules, but by light. Morning was no longer a fixed hour. It was the moment the gray sky softened just enough to tell them night had ended. Afternoon was when shadows grew long across the snow outside the windows. Evening came as soon as the light thinned again, slipping quietly away. People adjusted without speaking about it. They rose when they felt rested. They ate when hunger arrived. They rested when the cold made everything feel heavier. The world outside offered no urgency, so the inside slowed to match it. Windows were wiped clear more often now, not to look for change, but to confirm sameness. The same frozen streets, the same unmoved drifts, the same quiet sky. There was comfort in the predictability of it. Children asked fewer questions. They adapted quickly, curling up with books, drawing pictures of snow-covered houses, inventing games that required little space and no noise. Their laughter came softly, then faded, like everything else in the frozen days. Adults found themselves thinking more. Memories surfaced, other winters, other moments of waiting, other times life had been forced to pause. Thoughts drifted without pressure, without the need to be resolved. The cold outside held steady. It did not worsen. It did not ease. It simply remained, like a long, quiet sentence that had not yet reached its end. As night returned once more, lamps glowed warmly in windows across towns and cities, small points of light scattered through the frozen dark. Each one held someone waiting. Each one held warmth. Each one held time, moving slowly, carefully forward. By the sixth day, the world had grown smaller, not in a frightening way, but in a gentle, narrowing sense. Life had folded itself inward, reducing itself to rooms, to corners, to familiar paths between kitchen and window, bed and chair. People stopped thinking about the outside as a place they might soon return to. Instead, it became something distant, observed, almost imagined. Rooms took on new meaning. The kitchen was warmth and nourishment. The living room was rest. Bedrooms were shelters within shelters, quiet and dim. Even hallways felt important now, holding the heat as it traveled slowly from one space to another. People noticed details they had overlooked before. A small crack in a wall, the way light touched the edge of a table, the sound of the house settling as temperatures shifted. Every home seemed to breathe. Phones were checked less often. There was rarely new information and nothing anyone could act on. Updates repeated themselves. Cold remained. Roads stayed closed. Crews waited for safer conditions. So people waited too. Some napped during the day without guilt. Others stayed awake late, listening to the soft hum of heat and the distant whisper of wind against walls. Sleep came in waves, deep, then light, then deep again. Outside, the frozen world stayed perfectly still. No tracks marked the snow, no plows passed, no signs of movement disturbed the surface. It looked untouched, preserved, as if time itself had paused there. And inside, thousands of lives continued quietly, gently, reduced to their simplest forms: warmth, rest, patience. By the seventh day, people found themselves listening more carefully, not just to the radio or the weather reports, but to the world itself. They listened for the sound of dripping water that might mean thawing, or worse, a problem. They listened for the subtle change in wind, the way it brushed against walls and windows. They listened for any sound that felt different from the days before. Most of the time there was nothing new. The cold remained steady, deep, unmoving. Snowbanks stayed firm. Ice held tight. The air outside still looked heavy, as if it would resist any attempt to move through it. Inside, people moved slowly, conserving warmth without thinking about it anymore. It had become instinct. Hands wrapped around warm cups. Feet stayed tucked beneath blankets. Breaths were measured and calm. Radios murmured softly in the background. Meteorologists spoke with care, explaining pressure systems and stalled fronts. They used words like persistent and unusual. They reminded listeners that help would come when the cold loosened its grip. When the radio went quiet again, The houses felt even quieter than before, yet something subtle had shifted. The waiting no longer felt tense, it felt patient. People trusted the routines they had built, trusted the warmth they guarded, trusted that the cold, no matter how deep, could not hold forever. Outside, the north remained frozen. Inside, life continued, soft, steady, and unhurried. By the 8th day, comfort had become something intentional. It was no longer accidental or assumed. People created it carefully from small things. A favorite mug was chosen instead of any other. A blanket was folded just right. A chair was moved closer to the heater, angled toward the window. These choices mattered now. Music played softly in some homes, slow songs, familiar melodies, nothing too loud. The sound filled the rooms gently, never breaking the calm. In others, there was no music at all, just the steady rhythm of quiet life continuing. People reread books. Stories already known felt safer somehow, their endings certain, their paths familiar. Pages turned slowly. Sometimes the same paragraph was read twice without anyone noticing. The cold outside remained firm. Ice coated everything it touched, turning ordinary objects into sculptures, mailboxes, railings, signs. The world looked beautiful in a distant, untouchable way, as if it belonged to another place entirely. Neighbors continued to check on one another. Messages stayed short, thoughtful, warm. No one wanted to use more energy than necessary, physical or emotional. The shared understanding needed no explanation. As evening came, lights glowed again behind frosted windows. The frozen towns looked peaceful from a distance, like something preserved in time. Inside each home, people prepared for another long night, not with worry, but with quiet readiness. The cold still held the north, but inside, comfort held its own ground. By the 9th day, the cold had lost its sharp edge, not because it had weakened, but because people had grown used to it. It was no longer something new to be noticed every moment. It became part of the background, like the walls, like the floor beneath their feet. The body adjusted, the mind adjusted. People woke without surprise. They no longer checked the temperature first thing. They already knew. Instead, they stretched slowly beneath blankets, listening to the quiet hum of heat and the deep stillness beyond the walls. Morning routines returned, altered but steady. Warm drinks were prepared, simple breakfasts eaten, windows wiped clear for a few moments of observation, then covered again. The same frozen view greeted everyone, unchanged and patient. Outside, the sky remained pale. The sun rose and fell low, never climbing high enough to offer comfort. Its light skimmed the ice, turning it faintly blue, then fading away once more. Inside, time continued to soften. People spoke less, but not because there was nothing to say. Words simply felt unnecessary. Shared silence became easy, even welcome. At night, sleep came more deeply now. The body, tired of guarding itself, rested fully when it could. Dreams slowed. Breathing deepened. The cold waited quietly outside, no longer knocking, no longer demanding attention. The north was still locked, but those inside had learned how to live gently within it. By the 10th day, the waiting felt almost ceremonial. People moved as though following an unspoken agreement with the cold, slow, respectful, careful not to waste warmth or energy. Every action had a softness to it, a calm deliberateness shaped by days of stillness. The houses felt older now, not worn, just wiser. Walls held heat more tightly, Floors remembered footsteps. Chairs seemed to fit their occupants better than before. Each home had settled into its role as a shelter, a steady companion through the freeze. Outside, nothing shifted. Snow remained untouched, its surface smooth and faintly reflective. Ice held firm on branches and wires, catching the light in quiet glints that vanished as soon as clouds drifted across the sky. People noticed their own breathing more. Slow in, slow out. There was comfort in the rhythm, in knowing that as long as breath continued, warmth could be guarded, patience could be maintained. Even worry had softened. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer pressed so hard. It rested in the background, quiet and manageable, like the cold itself. Night arrived again, gentle and early. Lights glowed behind curtains. Blankets were pulled close. The world beyond the walls stayed frozen, but inside, life continued, unremarkable, steady, and calm. The north held its silence, and the people within it held on, quietly. By the 11th day, something subtle changed. It wasn't visible at first. The snow looked the same. The sky held its pale gray tone. The cold still pressed against the walls with familiar weight. But the air felt different, not warmer, just less sharp, as if the cold had shifted its stance, loosening slightly, stretching after holding still for so long. People sensed it more than they saw it. A window fogged a little faster than usual. Breath near the glass lingered differently. The hum of heaters softened, no longer working quite as hard. No one spoke of it out loud at first. They simply noticed. Outside, a single branch released a thin line of frost, which fell silently into the snow below. The sound was almost nothing, but it was change. Inside, people moved with cautious hope. They did not rush. They did not celebrate. After so many days of stillness, patience had become a habit. They continued their routines, warming food, conserving energy, resting deeply. Yet eyes returned to windows more often now, not searching, just watching. The light that afternoon seemed slightly clearer, less dull. Shadows softened instead of sharpening. The day still ended early, but the darkness arrived with less weight than before. That night sleep came easily, and beneath the quiet, a shared feeling began to form, gentle, careful, and unspoken. The freeze was still holding, but perhaps slowly it was learning how to let go. By the 12th day, waiting no longer felt like something imposed. It had become a way of being. People moved through their homes without checking the time as often. The hours unfolded on their own, gentle and unforced. Morning light arrived softly, stayed briefly, and slipped away again, leaving behind a calm that felt earned. The cold was still there, but it no longer dominated every thought. It rested at the edges of awareness, like a deep winter sleep outside the walls. Heaters hummed steadily, no longer straining. Floors felt a little less sharp beneath socked feet. Hands warmed faster around cups. Small signs appeared, easy to miss. A drop of water formed beneath a kitchen sink and disappeared just as quickly. Ice on a window pane thinned into fragile lines instead of thick frost. The air inside felt slightly lighter, easier to breathe. People noticed these things quietly. There was no rush to act on them. After so many days of stillness, urgency had lost its meaning. If change was coming, it would come in its own time. Meals were still simple, blankets still stayed close, but conversations, when they happened, carried a softer tone, touched with something like relief. Outside, the frozen world remained mostly unchanged. Snowbanks stood firm, roads were still hidden, the sky stayed muted. Yet beneath it all, something was loosening, slowly, patiently, almost respectfully. The north was still holding its breath, but now it felt like the breath might soon be released. By the 13th day, the freeze began to soften in ways no forecast could fully explain. It wasn't warmth yet, it was movement. Ice along the edges of roofs cracked quietly, releasing thin sheets that slid down and rested atop the snow. Icicles shortened, their tips dripping once or twice before freezing again, unsure whether they were allowed to let go. People noticed the sounds first. A faint drip, a soft shift. The smallest creak as ice adjusted its grip. Windows were cleared more often now, not just out of habit, but curiosity. The world outside still looked white and still, but it no longer felt completely locked. Inside, doors between rooms were opened a little wider. Warm air traveled more freely now. Heaters rested between cycles instead of running endlessly. The homes themselves seemed to relax, as if they too sensed the change. People spoke a little more. Nothing loud, nothing excited. Just quiet observations shared across rooms or over messages to neighbors. Did you hear that drip? The frost looks thinner today. Outside, the sky brightened slightly, clouds thinning enough to let more light through. The sun still offered no warmth, but it lingered longer, its presence a reminder that the world beyond the freeze had not disappeared. That night, people slept with one less blanket, not because it was warm, but because it was possible. And in that small change, hope rested gently, without pressure. By the 14th day, the idea of outside began to return, not as a place to rush toward, but as a thought that felt real again. People tested their doors gently, not expecting success. A hand on the handle, a slow push. The door resisted at first, then gave just a little, enough to remind everyone that it was still a door, not a wall. No one stepped out yet. Cold air still waited beyond the frame, patient and deep. But the seal had loosened. Snow no longer pressed so tightly against the thresholds. The world was beginning to breathe again. Windows stayed open a crack longer after being wiped clear. The glass no longer iced over immediately. Frost retreated to the corners instead of claiming the whole pane. Outside, the silence had changed. It was still quiet, but no longer absolute. Somewhere far away, a faint sound carried, a branch releasing ice. Wind shifting direction. The smallest reminder that movement had returned to the land. Inside, people adjusted their routines once more. Coats were laid out, not worn, but ready. Boots were brought closer to doors. Gloves were dried carefully as if preparing for a journey that might happen soon. There was no celebration, only readiness. After so many days of waiting, no one rushed the ending. The freeze had taught patience, and patience stayed even as the cold began to loosen its grip. That night, people slept lightly, not from worry, but anticipation held gently like a quiet flame. By the 15th day, the snow was no longer untouched. It began with one set of footprints. Someone opened a door just far enough to step outside, boots sinking softly into the crusted surface. The sound was gentle, a muted crunch that felt almost loud after so many days of silence. They did not go far, just a few steps, just enough to feel the air again, just enough to remind the body what outside felt like. Cold still wrapped around everything, but it no longer felt endless. It moved, shifted, breathed. The air carried a faint sense of change, like winter loosening its hands. Soon more doors opened, not all at once, not hurriedly. One by one, people stepped out briefly, carefully. They checked mailboxes buried in snow, looked up at rooftops, stood still for a moment, listening. The frozen towns remained quiet, but no longer empty. The sound of shovels appeared, slow and steady, not frantic, not loud, just people reclaiming small spaces in front of their homes. Snow was moved aside thoughtfully, as if it deserved respect for the days it had ruled. Inside, homes stayed warm. Doors closed again after short visits outside. Coats were hung carefully, hands were warmed around mugs. The balance between indoors and outdoors had returned. That evening, lights still glowed behind windows, but now they felt like beacons, not shelters. The north was waking slowly, and no one rushed it. By the 16th day, the thaw did not announce itself. It simply continued. Ice loosened its grip without drama. Snow softened at the edges, no longer sharp, no longer sealed. Water traced slow, careful paths along gutters and steps, disappearing into the white below. People noticed how sound returned, a shovel scraping gently, a door closing down the street, a distant engine starting, then stopping again. Each sound felt important, not because it was loud, but because it was new. Neighbors saw one another again, bundled and quiet, exchanging nods instead of words. No one stayed outside long. The cold still demanded respect. But the shared presence felt grounding, reassuring. Inside the homes, routines shifted once more. Windows stayed uncovered longer. Doors were opened briefly to let in fresh air. Rooms felt larger again, as if the walls themselves had moved back slightly. People began to think ahead, not far ahead, just enough to imagine tomorrow being a little different from today. The freeze had not broken suddenly. It was easing slowly, gently, allowing everyone to adjust without shock, without hurry. That night, the darkness felt lighter. Sleep came easily, carrying with it a sense of closure beginning to form. By the 17th day, the North had released its hold. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Roads reappeared beneath layers of snow pushed carefully aside. Footpaths formed where people had walked before. The world outside felt reachable again, not welcoming, but possible. People stepped out longer now. They checked on neighbors in person. They shared quiet smiles. Some laughed softly, surprised by the sound of it. No one spoke of hardship much. There was no need. Survival had been simple, steady, and shared. Inside the homes, blankets were folded and set aside, not put away, just rested. Heaters were turned down slightly. Windows were open to let light and air return fully. The freeze had changed something. People moved slower even now. They listened more. They noticed warmth when it arrived. They remembered what it felt like to be still. The North would freeze again someday. Everyone knew that. But it would not feel quite the same, because now thousands carried the memory of waiting together, quietly, patiently, until the world was ready to move again.